While I don't consider myself to be an expert on Marvel's Ultimate Universe, I do have a fair share of the books that encompass that world. And while this may seem like a strange thing to say, considering how many of the Ultimate books I do own, I usually am pretty iffy on any given story in the Ultimate Universe. The reason I keep going with this world is because it is a large reason why I still read comics today. When I first started reading comics in and around 2001, the Ultimate Universe was young and had no continuity to confuse me and keep me from delving into the stories. So even when I have issues with the Ultimate Universe now, I keep going because of that bond I feel I have with it. My biggest complaint with many books in the Ultimate Universe is that it almost never feels new or exciting. I read all 100 issues of Ultimate X-Men before Ultimatum happened, and that series was canceled. And through that whole series, while I might have had trouble putting it into words when I was reading it monthly, the series never really felt like it was blazing new trails. It just felt like it was condensing all 40 years of the 616 Marvel Universe into a shorter span of time. You get to see Magneto and the Brotherhood, the Weapon X program, Proteus, Dark Phoenix, and the Hellfire Club, but instead of reading 2 decades of comics, you read 30 issues. And much of it isn't especially well written either. But I feel like most of the pre-Ultimatum Ultimate Universe is held in such high esteem because people don't especially want to trudge through decades of stories to find good storytelling. So they read the SparkNotes version of the Dark Phoenix saga, the Proteus story, the introduction of the Hellfire Club, etc., and that's good enough for them. This brings me to Ultimate Comics X-Men Volume 1, written by Nick Spenser, illustrated by Paco Medina, with covers by Carrie Andrews. I have only sampled a few of the post-Ultimatum stories in the Ultimate Universe, and this is easily my favorite one. It doesn't feel the need to slow itself down and explain every single thing that has happened to these characters, which brings them up to where they are now. Even though I read the first Ultimate X-Men series up to its conclusion, I still feel like I missed quite a bit here, and I don't even think that's a problem, necessarily. Things like why Kitty Pryde is calling herself Shroud, why Johnny Storm isn't hanging out with the Fantastic Four, why Jean Grey is running a separate program of some kind for mutants, and what is going on with Quicksilver. All of this I feel like will either be answered when I eventually read the books that I missed, or these issues will be addressed as I continue reading this series. They are things that might make you sit up and take notice and say, wow, that's weird. This isn't exactly like something I've read before. The characters are almost all completely recognizable, but then they are in places we haven't seen them in before. I feel like more stories should take this approach. Instead of dumbing down the story so that everyone can easily recognize who all the players are, and they can also easily recognize all the places that these players are in, just tell your story at a pace that we can follow, but you don't have to play it safe like the original Ultimate Universe seemed to do before the events of Ultimatum. I will say that while I enjoyed some of the mysteries that we got in this book, I could easily see this series going down a route where the audience keeps getting more and more mysteries to the point where you feel like dropping the book because it keeps introducing new questions without answering the old questions. I am very excited to read Volume 2 of Spenser's run, but I definitely want to see why Pietro Lyncher is doing what he's doing with Cerebra and the United States government. I want to see what is going on with Jean Grey and her little section of mutant allies, and I'd like to see what's going on in Egypt that we see in one page of this volume. And while we're talking about what's going on, I'm really curious to see what's going on with the last page reveal of this volume with Rogue. Since this book collects half a year of comic books, if none of these questions are answered by the end of Volume 2, I feel like we would never get the answers because they're not being answered in the first year of this relaunched title. I feel like Spenser made a smart move by only focusing on a couple of the characters in this story. While I definitely would like to see more of Storm and Colossus in the containment camps, or even a completely new series focusing on Jean Grey and her allies, I think, for now, it was a wise choice to start small for anyone who might not be overly familiar with all of these characters. Even myself, I've read most of the stories concerning these characters, and I would not have wanted to have read a 6-issue story where all of the students were living at Xavier's school. One of my biggest complaints with the original Ultimate X-Men series was the overabundance of characters that none of the writers really seemed to know what to do with, and I feel like throwing a few of the characters into the new status quo, as well as throwing the reader in as well, is a good way to get started on a relaunch. If we absolutely need to see one of these characters from the previous series, we can, but for now, it's not really needed. The voice for these characters feels very spot on. While the buddy relationship between Iceman and the Human Torch is nothing new, it was very heartwarming and at times very funny to read it here. While I have never much cared for Kitty Pryde, either in the 616 universe or the Ultimate Universe, I found myself very intrigued by the idea that she is forced to lead this group of mutants in a very bad situation. I'm especially interested in seeing her growth over the course of this series. And the Ultimate version of Rogue has become interesting to me maybe for the very first time ever since her less than thrilling introduction in Return to Weapon X by Mark Millar. The art in this book is great. Medina's art is what I would call a mixture of Mike Mignola and Bruce Timm. It's not clean and angular like Timm's art, but it's more clear and less covered in shadows like Mignola's art. I cannot say much more about it other than it is stylized in its own way, but it still gets the action of the book across very clearly, and it doesn't feel confusing at any point. If you feel comfortable reading something that isn't really photorealistic, but is consistent and easy to comprehend, you will like the art presented in this book. And Carrie Andrews' covers are maybe the best part of this book that I was most surprised with. Each cover is like a piece of pop art that makes you sit there and look at it for about twice as long as you really thought you were going to. I could easily see a collection of these covers showing up in a museum somewhere. That's how much I was impressed with these covers. Before reading this book, I was only mildly interested in sampling some of the post-Ultimatum stories in the Ultimate Universe. I enjoyed bits and pieces of the Ultimate Thor miniseries by Hickman. I really didn't care for Millar's first Ultimate Avengers arc, and I really did enjoy Jason Aaron's Ultimate Captain America miniseries. But even with the stories I mostly enjoyed, I don't think I can say I had the level of enthusiasm that I had for this story. It could be that I'm a big X-Men fan, and that most definitely has a part, for sure. But none of the books that I read in the Ultimate Universe really felt like they were doing anything exciting. Finally, I am seeing a book that isn't afraid to shake things up. I look forward to seeing how far this series is willing to take this new status quo, and I am now more interested in seeing how far this new status quo will be carried over into the other Ultimate titles contemporary to this one. Anyone who is interested in reading a new comic book and maybe interested in seeing what the X-Men is about but not reading 50 years of X-Men stories, I would definitely recommend Ultimate Comics X-Men by Nick Spenser and Paco Medina to anyone who is interested in reading a good, fast-paced, exciting story.